Do you want to be ahead of the game for the latest in arts, music, cuisine, and entertainment across the Middle East's most dynamic capital cities? Al Monitor is proud to launch our City Pulse newsletters, focused exclusively on local news, starting in Riyadh, Dubai, Istanbul, and Doha. Each week, our on-the-ground writers in these cities cover the latest cultural happenings and trends, so you have everything you need to know for the best local experiences. To subscribe for free, go to almonitor.com, that's al-monitor.com, and sign up on our newsletter page.
Welcome to On the Middle East, where we break down the big and interesting stories in the region. My name is Amran Zaman. Today, I'll be discussing the dizzying developments around the Israel-Iran conflict. It appears to have ended with the intervention of President Donald Trump. But is the conflict really over? It was Israel that instigated the latest round of crippling attacks against Iran, wiping out its top military leaders and nuclear scientists. Israel's offensive came just 2 days before Iran and the United States were due to continue nuclear talks. Iran was badly battered, but its regime has survived, and the extent of the damage to its nuclear facilities after America bombed them remains something of a mystery. But even as both sides declare victory, there appears to be no clear winners, and the future of the region remains unpredictable as ever. With us here to discuss the latest situation is Vali Nasr, a leading scholar of Iranian affairs and the author of the recently published Iran's Grand Strategy. So welcome to our program, Vali.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on.
Well, so much has happened in the past 24 hours. We now have a ceasefire between Israel and Iran. So my first question to you is, do you believe that this is sort of the end of the conflict? Should everyone feel slightly safer and more confident now?
I think it's the end of a phase of the conflict. We were actually in an open war, first an open war between Iran and Israel, as intense as that war could be, because they're not going to be fighting with tanks and artillery and soldiers. They don't have a border. So this is what their war was. And then there was a point at which, with Israel's prodding, it looked like the United States was going to join the war, although fortunately that ended up being short-lived. So we're at the end of that phase, but the conflict between Iran and Israel is not over. The rivalry is not over. And increasingly, we see that the issue of Iran's nuclear program was not resolved with this war. And so basically, this war has ended up being a phase that obviously will decide where we go, but it didn't settle anything.
Well, doesn't that make the belligerent look weaker? Because after all, I mean, if we look at this immediate phase of the war, as you put it, Israel attacked first. And we all assumed pretty much that one of the goals was to severely weaken the whole nuclear program to the point of it setting it back by decades. And, a bonus would have obviously been if the people would have risen up against the regime and the regime would have crumbled. None of those things happened. So let's first look at this from Israel's point of view, because obviously both sides claimed victory. How did Israel come out of this?
I think the glass is half full for them, or half empty, whichever way you look at it. You're correct. Their aim was to destroy Iran's nuclear program. Secondly, was to collapse Iran's military, if not the state altogether, so Iran would not be able to respond. That's why they went after assassinating Iran's top commanders right away. And then, as you said, the bonus would have been if there was some kind of regime change, and if not that, regime collapse, mayhem, etc., which would have downgraded Iran as a rival against Israel significantly. It didn't achieve any of these. It didn't achieve destroying Iran's nuclear program. And for that, actually, from the beginning, they knew they needed the United States. They were successful in bringing the U.S. in, but the U.S.'s strike apparently was not effective, and the U.S. right now does not want to follow up. Secondly, I think to their surprise, and this is perhaps the biggest surprise to them, is that Iran's military did not collapse. Within 48 hours, it started hitting Israel pretty hard. to the point that towards the end, Israel perhaps was running out of interceptors to be able to mount its Iron Dome defenses. Iran's missiles were not 100% effective, and they were shot down, but they were effective enough to basically take the war to the Israeli population, to Israel's infrastructure, and also they hit many strategic sites in Israel. And so I think by the end of the first week, it was very clear that Israel was entering a war that it was not prepared for. It had entered this war thinking it's going to be a quick knockout of its opponent, and now it was getting involved in what looked like a much longer bout. And so I think they were also ready for a ceasefire by the time President Trump announced it.
So obviously the very immediate lesson of this is that, well, we already knew without the United States, Israel can basically not achieve any of its goals. And we have a United States that's increasingly skeptical of foreign military intervention. And we also how irritated President Trump became when he saw that that ceasefire was being violated and directing much of his wrath at Israel. On the other hand, you have an Iran that was completely isolated, none of its proxies really stepping up to the plate. So what does this tell us about Iran itself, and how did that reflect inside Iran? Does Iran kind of look like this, well, the underdog who somehow managed to stand up to all the might of the world?
I think to your first point, Israel's main vulnerability is that as a small country in a much larger Arab, Turkish, Iranian Middle East, it has subscribed to a strategy of basically settling all of its security issues through military might. And it doesn't take a genius to calculate that its resources are not sufficient for this strategy. And therefore, the United States is essential to Israel's bullish militaristic strategy. But as we see, the United States is getting tired or worried about this, the way Israel is using it as part of its security strategy. And I think that makes Israel very vulnerable. And at this moment, I think this war and the outcome of it has exposed that vulnerability that Israel has. Now, Iran, you're right. I think Iran's proxy strategy collapsed with the fall of Syria and the implosion of Hezbollah. I think Iran, from that point forward, understood that its defenses have to be mounted from its own territory. But that also brought a certain strength to it, because when Iran is defending with Hezbollah and Syria, then its population basically can look at this and say, these are nonsensical wars. Why do we need these forces? It's not tangible to them. But when they are being directly attacked on their own soil, I think nationalism kicked in Iran, which rose above whether you were pro-regime, anti-regime, neutral. And that actually gave them a certain strategic depth. So not only was view of people rising up was a sort of a fantasy story imagined in Washington and Israel as an outcome, but I think for a while the opposite has happened. That the population now understand that Israel is a national security threat to Iran, period. That it's a country that is capable and willing to attack at will and do enormous amount of destruction, and that whether you like the regime or not, and even if this regime goes, you need to have something to defend you against Israel. And I think that has changed the conversation in Iran much more. I think now there is actually a popular base of support for nuclear weapons, because unlike Turkey, Iran does not have a NATO alliance to protect it, or unlike Saudi Arabia, it cannot look to a strategic partnership with the United States. And so it's going to go forward having to face Israel on its own, and that makes the population very nervous.
So we're in this very curious situation of, on the one hand, Iran becoming even more determined to acquire nuclear weapons, and on top of it, the people supporting that. Now, you point to a very interesting dynamic of nationalism. Would you qualify this as Persian nationalism? And if so, how does that play out with the minority groups, the Kurds, the Baloch, the Azeris, who Israel was obviously hoping would rise up?
Well, the largest and probably the most consequential of these are the Azeris. But the Azeris are also not sort of as separated from the Persians as let's say the Kurds or the Baluchis might be. The supreme leader in Iran is Azeri. Large numbers of the commanders of the Revolutionary Guards are Azeri. A huge portion of the population in Tehran, in Qom, in other Iranian cities are Azeris. In fact, Azeris have ruled over Iran for over 200 years, with the exception of the Pahlavis and a few other rulers. And yes, there is Azeri nationalism brewing in Iran. There's sort of a pan-Turkic movement going on. But I think, you know, at this moment, they didn't see themselves as separate from Iranians. So they may see themselves as separate from Persians, but not as separate from Iranians from the country. The Baluchis, their leader actually came out and defended Iran's territorial integrity. The Kurds perhaps are more, you know, fence-sitting. But, you know, this fear of what a weakening of Iranian state may do to Iran's territorial integrity, to ethnic uprisings, actually pushes more and more Persians in defense of the state. In other words, if the choice becomes between defending the ruling state and its military now, or stepping aside and letting Iran disintegrate, and if these are the two choices, overwhelming majority will not choose the disintegration of Iran. I mean, that's actually a phobia Iranians have had, you know, going back to World War I, that the outsiders want to break up their country. So I think the Israeli-American attack on Iran, if anything, has strengthened the Islamic Republic for a period. And depending on how they play their cards going forward, it actually could prolong the life of the Islamic Republic because of the rally to the flag, because of the fear of disintegration, because of, you know, Iranian anger at their territorial integrity, sovereignty having been violated by Israel. So all of these things are now part of the political discourse in Iran. It's not like before the attack, which was, are you pro-regime or are you anti-regime? It's a lot more complicated. You can be anti-regime and want change, but you also could be supportive of Iran defending itself at this moment and be opposed to those who say, oh, we're doing this to liberate you.
It's actually quite fascinating because also, I mean, we tend to forget that Iran is not a colonialist construct, as Iraq and Syria were to some extent. So in that respect, very much resembles Turkey.
Yeah, exactly.
And so will the regime be smart enough then to seize this moment to sort of improve its relationship with the people, as you've suggested in other interviews? Do you think they have that kind of, you know, smarts?
Well, we'll see. You know, obviously there are different voices within that regime. There are hardliners, ideological voices, and there are moderates and pragmatic voices. But I think it has become very, very clear to the regime that the strategic depth of its people was very important in this fight. And it was not Islamic ideology or revolutionary ideology, unlike, you know, decades ago during Iran-Iraq war. This time, it was not these ideologies that bound them to the people. It was Iranian nationalism. And I think whether the regime wants or not, it will have to, it cannot face America and Israel going forward without keeping people on its side. And I think even the most hardline Revolutionary Guard commanders, thinking in purely military strategic terms, will understand this reality. And I think, you know, Iran is primed for a new social contract between its government and its people. So now it depends, obviously, on decisions of people like the supreme leader, but it also depends on whether there is enough breathing space created by this ceasefire to allow this to basically manifest itself.
Well, in fact, it makes me wonder whether this isn't also President Pezeshkian's moment, because for better or for worse, he does sort of symbolize some form of reformism, modernity, and outreach to minorities, being a member of one himself. He said
member of two, actually, because
Azeri,
he's fluent in both Kurdish and Azeri.
Yes, I've even heard it said that he speaks Kurmanji Kurdish better than he speaks Farsi. which is quite interesting. So do you think that they will create space for people like him, possibly for people like the former foreign minister, what's his name?
Javad Zarif.
Yeah. People like that. Will they step to the fore, you think?
I think yes. I think although one thing we should be careful looking at history is that these kinds of transformations don't appear overnight. When we look back, we'll see them happening. Like there is a period when China went from Mao to Deng Xiaoping. It took 7-8 years. Or in the Soviet Union, the period after Brezhnev until we arrived at Gorbachev and Yeltsin. But I think this war probably have expedited or accelerated the process. But I think we shouldn't expect that all of a sudden tomorrow morning we're going to see a major changes. But I do think that the reality of this moment is just too powerful for Iranians. What they survived, what they went through, and I think this moment where they united together over the bridges that have over the gulfs that have separated them is a force unto itself. I don't want to say it's deterministic, but it wasn't there before this attack. So there is a domestic dimension here. And I think that Iran's leaders, even as pragmatically they plan war and resistance to the US and Israel, will understand that the Iranian people cannot be their Achilles heel. They have to be an additional source of strength. This is just like, basic strategic thinking. It doesn't require them to convert to sort of secular liberalism to understand this. It's just basically pragmatism for them to continue this fight.
Well, this whole moment, I think, was a wake-up call for everybody. I think it's also probably allowed Israel to realize, as you said, the fantasy that they had fabricated of an uprising, a popular uprising, and now knowing their own limits, what will they do? Because obviously they haven't achieved their objectives, and what they face is potentially a more cohesive, more powerful, and more determined Iran. So if you're Benjamin Netanyahu, what do you do? What is your probable next step?
I think he gambled big. He overread into Israel's success with Hezbollah, into Iran's weakness, and thought that he could give the knockout punch to Iran and be done with Iran once and forever. So I think he is politically vulnerable. As the dust settles, his claims of this having been an absolute success, etc., will gradually not hold. And that's exactly why I think I read the news that he's looking at early elections to capture this moment before people begin to have different theories of what has happened. But I think the issue is larger than Israel. Israel, as I said, has a strategic view that it has the military might, and it has basically one way of dealing with its challenges, which is to win over them militarily. And if it doesn't revise that strategy, and it takes time to do so, and if it really subscribes into a long war with Iran, it's not good for Iran, it's not good for Israel, it's not good for the United States, and it won't be good for the region. Because I think what's very clear is that neither side has the capability to knock the other side out. And both of them have to eventually come to this realization that they have to figure out a way to a cold peace, and then maybe to a better place, that maybe one of the best outcomes of this war is that the war is going to be costly to them, and it's not going to be easy. And they shouldn't look at war as a way of solving their problems, both Iranians and Israelis.
Today's transformation of the Middle East is at the center of global geopolitics. Whether you're an analyst, diplomat, executive, or academic, you need the best reporting and analysis to understand what's really happening on the ground and what it means for the world. Al-Monitor is the award-winning independent leader in Middle East news. From Riyadh to Beirut, Abu Dhabi to Doha, and Baghdad to Tehran, our team of over 100 expert journalists report daily on the top stories driving the regional trends. Download our mobile app and subscribe to Al-Monitor to follow what leaders and decision makers are reading every day. Go to almonitor.com, that's AL-MONITOR.com, and use promo code POD25, POD25 for a discount.
But maybe the smart thing for Iran too is having proven that, they're not quite as vulnerable as they are, and even faced with these huge bombs that apparently didn't quite do the job, maybe that gives them more leverage at the table for diplomacy and for a diplomatic kind of solution. And I'm sure that President Trump would be very keen to be seen as the architect of that.
Well, I think actually President Trump also, his situation's changed. I mean, he took a risk, maybe, and I think imprudently, to give the green light to Israel to upend the nuclear talks. And then he joined the bombing and they bombed. Now that they have bombed, he has spent that card that he was holding over Iran all along, that you have 60 days, and if you don't sign a deal, I'm going to attack you. Okay, you attacked me. You gave it your best shot. It didn't work. You can attack again. And now you're looking at a possibility that if your attacks don't work, or if we retaliate more severely this time, rather than a performative attack that they did, that you have to get involved in a war with Iran. So I think now the stakes for him are higher. And that's why he was so quick to not make anything of Iran's response and immediately go to ceasefire with Iran, surprise everybody, surprise Israel, come out and even try to bully Israel publicly into obeying the rules of the ceasefire. All of it suggests that now the burden is on him. He entered the war, now he owns the ceasefire. If the ceasefire doesn't work, the stakes for him are quite high. And so he's no longer an observer here. He can't say, well, Israel and Iran need to sort it out. And I think everything we talked about, Amberine, whether this period is used well, whether it's not, whether there can be a nuclear deal, whether we can move towards a period of stability, not entirely depends on whether President Trump can deliver during this period.
Well, of course, both sides will need to be very careful to not be perceived as the spoiler in all of this, knowing President Trump's sort of wrath. But I want to turn to a different question, which is related to an earlier magnificent book of yours. And of course, we see your latest wonderful book on the shelf there, Iran's Grand Strategy. But I want to talk a little bit about what you were discussing in the earlier one, the Shia revival. You made this very important point that it's now about nationalism rather than Islamist ideology in Iran. So where does that leave the Shia revival? How do the Shia feel about this moment where they saw Iran so alone yet able to survive? Has this burnished Iran's credentials as a Shia, the big Shia power, or does that not have any relevance in your view?
Well, I mean, it still does, in the sense that even if Iran does not promote or wear its Shia identity on its sleeve or promote it actively like it did right after the Iraq War, it's part of its identity. Iran cannot shake being Shia any more than Israel can shake being Jewish. So the question is, when is it to your benefit, when it's not? Of course, even in the Arab world, there are Shia populations who feel a sense of affinity with Iran, even if they don't like its government or don't like its policies. They don't like it to be defeated or humiliated. And they also worry that if Israel had triumphed and really had weakened Iran and defeated Iran, that the Shia populations in the Arab world or in Pakistan would not have been immune to a backlash. That ultimately the collapse of Iran would have been an earthquake, the aftershocks of which would have visited on them. So it's not so much about a sort of a hard Shia, force in the region. It is more about the fact that, Iran as a regional player, as a regional reality, as a country of this size, I think second in terms of populations, third in terms of population size to Egypt and Turkey. It stands for Iranian identity, Persian identity, but it also stands for Shiism. It's viewed as the most important Shia power. So it doesn't mean that sectarianism is ramp. It means that Iran still is the one force in the region that is standing up to Israel. This matters to Lebanese Shias, matters to Palestinians, will matter to Iraqi Shias. The fact that it didn't completely collapse gives them a sigh of relief. If you're Iraqi Shia, you would have worried what might happen to the balance, the very delicate balance of power in Iraq if Iran were to unravel. So I think it's sectarianism is just under the surface, if you would, but it's not an important determinative factor right now, but it's not completely absent either.
Well, a small question related to that about Saudi Arabia and its own Shia population that happens to live in the areas where most of the oil is, right? I mean, if you're Saudi Arabia, is that population potentially a threat? And is that part of the worry when Saudi Arabia considers its relationship with Iran?
It has diminished over the years, partly because Iran stopped actually trying to use that Shia population a while ago. In fact, Iran's threat moved from the Shia population inside Saudi Arabia to Yemen, which is also a Shia ally of Iran, Shia of sorts, ally of Iran. And I think Saudi Arabia also under Mohammed bin Salman, after initially taking a very harsh position with the Shia, executing many of the political activists, etc., actually has spent a lot of effort to mend ties between the Shia region and the central government. The tone of the Saudi government is now less ardent Wahhabi religious, ideologically religious. There's more talk about Saudi nationalism, which the Saudi Shia can feel a part of as citizens of the country rather than as being outsiders to a predominantly Wahhabi identity of Saudi Arabia. So I think the Saudis feel less about that, but also they are now have a normalization of relations with Iran. And the most fundamental basis of this is that Iran has not targeted Saudi Arabia directly. The Houthis have not shot a missile at Saudi Arabia the past 2.5 years. And Iran is not supporting any kind of Shia movement in the eastern province. And so the longer this goes forward, the less I think Iran-Saudi relations will be about these sectarian tensions. Although the reality, again, is that Saudi Arabia has been viewed for a long time as the most important Sunni power in the Muslim world because of its location and the presence of Mecca and Medina in Saudi territory, and also the title that the king of Saudi Arabia carries as the protector of the two holy shrines. So it stands for Sunnis around the Muslim world as the symbol, and Iran is the symbol of Shiism. So I think that normalization between them was an important point at which the sectarian tension was reduced, at least as a live wire political issue in the region. Now, I think for Saudis, it's very, very key that America and Iran don't go to war in the Gulf, because if they do, even if they don't target Saudi oil fields again, if Iranians don't do that, I think the level of tensions will damage the economic projects that Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar have embarked upon. So I think those countries for the first time have a very different theory of where they want the conflict with Iran to go. They want the US not to go to war, not to follow Israel's lead. Actually sit down and negotiate, find a cold peace that would de-escalate tensions with Iran. I think that's where they are. And as part of that, I think neither Iran nor Saudi Arabia are actually trying to use sectarianism as a way of increasing regional tensions.
That's very interesting. And of course, don't forget that Turkey would like to think of itself as the leading power. And in some senses, I would say it has more heft than Saudi Arabia.
Absolutely, I think it does. But Saudi Arabia, particularly among hardline Sunnis, because of also the many years that it invested in that sort of a strand of militant Sunnis, it has more relationship or cachet there, whereas Turkey never spent funds on seminaries and clerics and ideological Sunnism. But you're right. The legacy of Ottoman Empire in Turkey's relations with the Middle East runs very bold.
Well, Turkey doesn't have deep enough pockets as well to do what Saudi Arabia did for decades, though. I hear from people in places like Bangladesh, for example, that since bin Salman, became the effective ruler, that sort of activity is being scaled back.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
so can we
Exactly.
say that one of the perhaps unintended consequences of this recent spasm of violence between Israel and Iran has been to sort of put this whole Sunni-Shia rivalry a bit on the back burner and help unite the global ummah in a way that it never could have in the past, because now there's so much anger focused at Israel that seems to supersede, oh, I'm a Sunni or you're a Shia.
I agree with you. I mean, in fact, the Western coverage of Middle East reaction to this war is wholly, focused on what governments are saying and doing. But the mood on the street is something completely different. Whether in Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, Iraq, the people are rooting for Iran. Not that they can do anything about it, but it tells you that the anger that's coming out of what happened in Gaza is not helping the case for the US and Israel to go after Iran. So that's at one level a reality, and Arab leaders obviously understand this. Their back was already to the wall over the Gaza issue, where they had to keep their populations quiet to protect their relations with America and Israel. Now they don't want Iran, the Iran issue add to this gulf that exists between Arab populations and their rulers. But beyond that, even the rulers now are looking at a new reality in the Middle East, which is Israel is coming out of the Gaza war, out of destruction of Hezbollah, with a view that it's the triumphant military superpower in the region, that basically it's going to set the rules for this region because it has America on its back and there is nobody who can stand in its way. Now, the time when sectarianism was at its height was when the Iranians thought that Saudis were the main rival, and the Saudis thought that Iran and its proxies were the main problem. But now both of them see that the other side is not the main problem. The main challenge for domination in this Middle East is Israel. And do they want to live under a Middle East that is based on the rules of Gaza and South Beirut? Is this the way Israel wants to dominate this region? And even, as you know, there's Turkish politicians who, after the bombing of Iran, began to say, we're going to be next. It's not far-fetched. In other words, if Israel had got its way with Iran, it could basically tell Turkey that I'm going to decide the fate of Syria, right? And I'm willing to, test the waters that you need to get out of Idlib, or you need to agree to X, Y, and Z. And then, Turkey would have been caught in a situation that it doesn't want to. So whether you're in Ankara or Riyadh, you basically don't want Iran to collapse right now. Not out of love of Iran, but out of what the consequences would be. Iranians need the Arabs and the Turks. I think the Turks and the Arabs need Iran. It's a very sort of a simple game of balancing power. So Iran is Middle East is a lot like 19th century Europe, sort of Bismarckian Europe. You have these power centers. Whenever one begins to sort of dominate, the other ones coalesce to balance it. When Iran looked like to be the rising hegemon in 2014, 2016, everybody was balancing to contain Iran. Now, Iran is not the problem anymore. It's the problem in the Western imagination or Israeli imagination. But for Saudis, for Turks, Iran is not right now the rising force in the region. Who's the rising force that you need to balance against? And it's Israel. Now, Iran is Shia, Turkey is Sunni, Saudi Arabia is Sunni. And if they're going to work together in order to balance against Israel, they have to do it in the name of unity, sort of a Middle East unity. And the lowest common denominator between all of them is that they're Muslim, right? That they basically share that. So, and that also tracks with where their populations are. And I think, again, part of the strategic mistake that Israel and the United States are making is that they want to tackle a region of 200 million people with only a military solution, to assert Israel's prerogative to dominate and have its way as a very small portion of this region over the entire region. And that that ultimately, I don't think will work and will only unite public opinion and governments around the region to resist this.
Well, yes, and moreover, I think the limits of that, military power, the shock and awe, has been exposed as not being fully effective. So I think the big takeaway should be that diplomacy is still the most effective tool. And let's hope that all sides recognize that, and that people come back to the table and that we can have some kind of, however imperfect, peace in the Middle East.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for joining us, Vali. It was a fascinating conversation and I could have just kept going on, but I know you're pressed for time. And yeah.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to come on your show.
Well, what a fascinating guest, and there's still so much more to discuss. Please stay tuned for further episodes of On the Middle East, and do go to our website, www.al-monitor.com, for in-depth and independent coverage of the region and beyond. Thank you and goodbye.